Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Microsoft 365 Virtual Marathon. My name is Antonio Maio. Thank you very much for joining me today. Hopefully you can all see my screen and hear me. Today I'm going to be talking to you about end-to-end records management in Microsoft 365. So I'm going to be going through all of the various great capabilities available for managing your corporate records in Microsoft 365. I'm a director with Protiviti. I'm a senior enterprise architect and a Microsoft MVP. My Twitter handle is there, Antonio Maio 2. Please feel free to reach out. Should you have any questions after this, I'd be happy to follow back and answer any questions you might have. So thanks again for joining us. Hopefully the next hour will be informative for you. Now, just a couple of quick slides. If you've been on this conference for a little while, you've seen some of these already. The Microsoft SharePoint conference that was supposed to be happening this month in Las Vegas has unfortunately been postponed to next year for good reason, of course, due to COVID-19. It has been postponed and has been renamed actually to Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference. And it's happening March 23rd to 25th in 2021. So we hope to see you there. I'm planning to be there. It should be a great show. Big thank you to our sponsors. Events like this, I've helped put on events like this in my city. I'm based in Canada, for those that don't know, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada specifically. I've put on events like this here in Ottawa before, and these events don't happen without the support of great sponsors like these. So we thank our sponsors. Please do check them out. All of these companies do provide great products and services related to Microsoft 365. The conference is giving away some prizes with a raffle, in particular 3 Oculus Quest devices. There's a URL here. Please go sign up for the raffles. Those devices are awesome devices, so hopefully you win. And then finally, please do consider donating to the causes that this conference is supporting, in particular the United Way and the International Medical Corps. The URLs are there. Those are great organizations that support people throughout crises like these, like the COVID-19 pandemic that's going on, and others as well. All right, so we've got a packed agenda today talking about records management. I'm going to start off with a bit of an introduction, and then I'm going to go right into the features related to records management. Things like retention labels, retention label policies, automatically applying those labels, and a number of other capabilities, some of which are brand new that I'm really excited to talk to you about. I'm also going to talk about Microsoft Information Protection, or what's called MIP. MIP is a security classification tool. It's very different from records management, but with our customers, we often look at both rolling out a sensitivity labeling solution like MIP, as well as a retention label and records management solution that's built into Microsoft 365. These solutions often go hand in hand, so I've decided to include them both here. And then finally some recommended next steps I'm going to try to end up on. I've got a packed schedule of topics to talk to you about, so I'm going to jump right in. And please do post any questions to the live Q&A if you can. All right, so this is what records management has traditionally looked like. Rooms or warehouses of file folders and filing cabinets full of documents. Often those documents would be kept in boxes, and an entire box would be shipped off to a warehouse when it was time to manage them as records. There is, in fact, a lot of this that still happens today. And those are gradually being turned to digital records. What we look forward to and what we strive for, especially in Microsoft 365, is a more modern way of managing records. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm going to talk to you about what modern records management looks like in Microsoft 365. All right, so first a quick introduction to records management. What does it mean to manage documents as records? Well, first of all, when a document is a record, it's typically assigned a retention period. The idea of designating documents as records is to comply with some particular policy or regulation or some purpose within your organization for retaining that content for a period of time. Often we need to retain our tax documents for 7 years. Records very much fall into the same type of category. Tax documents typically are records. Now, when documents are declared as records, sometimes they become immutable. And that means that they cannot be modified. They can't be deleted either. Typically, when we're retaining a document as a record, we want to retain it in its form when it was declared as a record. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes retention periods are assigned to documents that are not formal records. They can still be edited and modified over time, but often they are, when declared as record, documents that should not be changed or deleted moving forward until the retention period expires. Now, with records, typically we go through a formal review and approval process before they can be deleted. We call this the disposition process. We are disposing of those documents when we delete them. Thus, it's called the disposition process. Often our records retention requirements, our records management requirements are dictated by regulations or policies that govern which types of documents should be declared as records and how long they should be retained for. As well, we typically want to protect our information because it may be required in the future, perhaps for litigation, perhaps for tax purposes, perhaps for some regulatory compliance purpose as well. It also could be for a business need. Often we're protecting that information from being deleted, thus declaring it a record or assigning a retention period to it. Now, what's the driver for declaring documents as records? I've mentioned a couple of these already. The first typically is regulatory compliance. So there are numerous regulatory frameworks, depending on your jurisdiction, which dictate how long you must retain certain types of documents for. They often relate to documents like contracts, invoices, tax documents, perhaps employee files, customer data, and so on. I've listed a few of the examples here of regulatory frameworks that relate specifically to retaining documents for specific periods of time. Rules like SEC Rule 17A4, the FINRA Rule 4511, and so on. We may also declare documents as records and retain them for legal e-discovery purposes, perhaps for the purposes of litigation or legal holds. Sometimes we have a legal obligation to retain those documents because there are some outstanding legal case that's currently underway, and we are not permitted by law to delete those documents before the legal case is resolved. And then finally, it might be due to some internal purpose. If you're a government or public sector agency, it may be related to some legislation that you need to comply with, perhaps an access to information legislation or a freedom of information and privacy regulation as well. Perhaps your organization has certain internal policies where certain types of documents or data must be retained for a particular period of time. System logs is a great example that people often don't think about. System logs are often required to investigate security breaches should they happen, but security breaches typically aren't detected until some period of time after they happen. So I have often seen many organizations retain system logs for a period of 2 years. That way, if a data breach occurs at some point, you can actually trace back in your system logs to find the root cause. So just one example to share with you there. So these are the typical drivers for why we might manage documents or data as records. Now, what does it mean to manage a document as a record in Microsoft 365? How does Microsoft 365 actually address the need for records management, right? What does it refer to as a record? So first of all, records are managed in place within Microsoft 365. If you've done records management in traditional legacy systems, often they are moved to another system or they're archived in another system as part of being declared a record. In the Microsoft 365 platform, when you declare a document a record or assign a retention label to it to declare a record, the documents remain where they are and they are managed as records in place, and policies are enforced on those documents where they currently live. As well, we use things like labels and label policies to assign a retention period to a document. This process can be manual, so it can be user-based, where a user goes and assigns a retention label, or it can be automated based on rules that you can configure. And I'm going to show you both of these experiences in just a few minutes. We can automatically apply policies for label assignment, so to automate that process of assigning labels, and we can actually gather analytics on how many of different types of record labels do we have within the organization. So sorry, let me restate that. What I mean is we can actually gather analytics on how frequently has a particular retention label been used? So how much of various types of records do we have in the organization? Those types of analytics are available within the platform. We have the concept of event-based retention. So often when you assign a retention period to a document, there's a trigger, and that trigger means this is when that retention time period begins. right? That retention period could be when a document's created. It could be when a document was last modified. It could be when the label was actually applied, which means it could be the date and time, or sorry, it could be the date when the document was actually declared a record. Or it could be based on an event. A common example of an event is when an employee leaves the organization. Another event might be when a product reaches the end of its life cycle, or when a contract expires, or a fiscal year end, or a calendar year end. These are all great examples of events that can trigger a retention period to begin on certain types of documents. There is a built-in disposition review process for records within Microsoft 365. I'm going to show you that in just a few minutes. And Microsoft MIP, so Microsoft Information Protection, is, again, I mentioned this earlier, it's not exactly records management, but it is a topic and a tool that's often discussed in the same vein as records management. Often we think about protecting our information, both from a perspective of retaining it for the period of time that we need, as well as protecting it based on its sensitivity. So is this document confidential? Is it high impact? Is it secret or top secret? Those types of sensitivities are what we're referring to here. And Microsoft Information Protection is the built-in tool within the Microsoft 365 platform that lets you do that, to manage the sensitivity of documents and enforce policies based on that sensitivity. So we like to talk about it in the same type of discussion as records management. Now, I'm going to talk to you about the various ways that you can assign retention periods to documents within Microsoft 365 and what those mean, what the impacts of those are. So there are three different artifacts, if you will, in Microsoft 365 that you would configure for managing documents as records. The first is a retention label. Now, you create a retention label and you assign it to a document, and that retention label designates how long the document will be kept. It also designates what the trigger is for that retention period, as well as what happens when the retention period expires. Okay, so keep that in mind, please, retention labels. We then have retention label policies. Now, retention label policies are used to take a collection of labels and publish them to a location. So let's say I want to take a collection of 10 labels and I want them to be available in the Exchange mailboxes of people within my finance department. I would use a retention label policy to collect those 10 labels and publish them to those mailboxes. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. And finally, there's a third concept called retention policies. Now, retention policies are different from retention labels and from retention label policies. Retention policies are used to manage more blanket policies around retention and deletion, and they are assigned often to containers. And when I say a container, I mean sometimes we refer to it as a location as well. A location would be an Exchange mailbox, or a SharePoint site, or a OneDrive for Business account, or a Microsoft 365 group, or Microsoft Teams chat, for example, Skype for Business, channel messages within Teams, and Exchange public folders. And so if I take the example of an Exchange mailbox, if I use a retention policy and assign that to an Exchange mailbox, I'm assigning a retention policy to all of the email within that Exchange mailbox. It's not as granular as retention labels. So let me show you what some of that looks like in just a second. First of all, I want to make sure that the difference here between how you use these three different concepts is clear. So I'm going to clarify here how you work with retention labels and retention label policies, and how those are used to publish those labels to locations. So first of all, I would define retention labels for my organization, right? Labels could be things like a budget, and a budget has a retention period of 5 years, and it's triggered off of the fiscal year end. When that retention period expires, the disposition process would be to destroy it, or delete it in this case. Contracts, and perhaps a master set of contracts, because sometimes organizations keep master sets of contracts and copies of contracts, and a master set might have a different retention period than the copy. In this case, a contract could be a retention label with a retention period of 10 years. And then the third example I want to talk about is financial reports related to general ledgers. In this case, that could have a retention period of 10 years. So these are examples of retention labels. And the collection of retention labels for an organization would typically be considered its file plan. Now, once those are configured, I would configure retention label policies. Now, I might create a policy that publishes the budgets label and the contracts label. and I'm going to publish that to all the Exchange mailboxes, to 3 SharePoint sites, to 10 OneDrive for Business accounts, and 3 Microsoft groups. I might create another retention label policy just to publish contracts. And I'm going to publish that to a different set of Exchange mailboxes, SharePoint sites, OneDrive for Business accounts, and Microsoft 365 groups. I could then create a third retention label where I'd publish the contract label and the financial reports label, and I'm going to publish that yet to a different set of locations. And then I'm going to create a fourth retention label policy where I take another set of retention labels and publish those yet to another set of locations. So just to repeat what I've done here, I've taken the budget label and the contract label. I've combined those into one retention label policy in order to publish those 2 labels to the location. By publishing to the location, they then become available for selection in the location. So those 3 SharePoint sites that we're talking about right here, once those are published to that location, a user could actually go to those SharePoint sites and choose those 2 labels for a document. They could choose one of those 2 labels for a document. I've taken that contracts and I've created a retention label policy. It's published that retention label to a different set of locations, and those locations can overlap with other policies. And so on. I've taken contracts and financial reports ledgers through a third retention label policy. I've published them to that different set of locations. And then finally, financial reports can be published to those other locations by that fourth retention label policy. This is how retention labels, retention label policies, and locations work. Okay, now if we go back to that third concept that I mentioned, retention policies. Retention policies, again, are more blanket policies. That's how I like to think of them. I can configure a single policy for the entire organization, or I could apply to just specific locations or users. That policy can be blanket. It can apply to all content, or it can apply to content that meets specific conditions, such as it can contain certain keywords or contain sensitive data. Now, the enforcement of retention policies is a little bit different than labels and retention label policies I mentioned earlier. They are typically enforced through hidden folders and libraries. So what happens is when a document is deleted or it's edited, a copy of it is automatically and silently copied to one of these hidden libraries or folders. So for example, for SharePoint Online and OneDrive sites, content will be preserved in what's called the preservation hold library. This is a hidden library within the SharePoint site. It is automatically created after you publish that retention policy and you delete your first document. In Exchange mailboxes and public folders, there's actually a hidden folder called the recoverable items folder where email is preserved. For Teams chat and channel messages, once again, content is preserved in the recoverable items folder within the Exchange mailbox that sits behind a team or Teams chat. And then finally, for Microsoft 365 groups, if I apply a retention policy to it, the group mailbox that gets created with the group has that recoverable items folder in that mailbox. And the site within that Microsoft 365 group has the preservation hold library. Both of those folders are both the folder and the library are being hidden, so that when a user deletes or edits content, it is automatically copied to those hidden folders or libraries. That's how retention policies work. Now, you would use retention policies very specifically for Microsoft Teams chat and channel messages, for Skype for Business, and for Exchange public folder content. You can also use them for Exchange mailboxes, SharePoint sites, OneDrive for Business accounts, and Microsoft 365 groups. That last set of locations, as you saw earlier, also applies to retention labels. So you do sometimes need to make a choice around which is the right tool, either retention labels or retention policies. And that may be affected by your license as well, which we'll talk about in just a couple minutes. Now, again, if I compare retention labels to retention policies, we can see here that both of them allow us to apply retention. Only retention labels allow us to do event-based retention. Both of them allow us to manage retention in SharePoint, OneDrive, Groups, and Exchange email. Only retention policies allow us to apply and manage retention in Microsoft Teams chats and channel messages, Skype for Business chat, or Exchange public folders. Only retention labels allow us to manage content as a record, so meaning documents cannot be edited or deleted. Both of them can be used to apply labels based on sensitive information or based on specific words or phrases. And then finally, we can only go down to the granularity of specific documents and emails with retention labels. So you can see that there are differences in the capabilities between these two. Okay, let's look at how we configure a retention label. So first of all, if you haven't seen it yet, this is the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. If you are formerly an Office 365 customer, and I have been trying very hard to use the term Microsoft 365, Office 365 has been renamed to Microsoft 365, and it's in fact a different license as well. In Office 365, you would have previously used the Security and Compliance Center. But now in Microsoft 365, Microsoft has split those two concepts, security and compliance, into two different consoles. This here is the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. There is another console called the Security Center, but we're going to focus on the Compliance Center for today. Now within here, I can click on this catalog item, and the catalog shows me various solutions that are available. And you can see here from the screen, there's one called Information Governance, and I could click on View to see that. Down a little lower, there's one called Records Management. That's the one that we're actually going to scroll down to and click on. So if I click on View under Records Management, I'm going to receive a description about the Records Management Solution console, if you will. And I'm going to click on Open Solution up here to actually enter the records management capabilities. Now the records management console, again, I'll talk about it a little more in a second, but typically it's used if you have an E5 license for your organization. There are other licenses as well, so I don't want to get into a license discussion here, but it's important to note that E5 or the E5 compliance SKU are licenses that give you access to all of these records management capabilities. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to click on File Plan. And the file plan is where I manage my retention labels. It is the collection of retention labels for my organization. I'm going to first click on Create Label. I have a few options here. I'm going to click on Create a Retention Label. Now here I'm going to give it a name and a description. You'll notice that there's both a description for administrators, that's record managers really that are accessing this console, as well as end users. And you'll see in a few minutes where that description for end users actually appears in the user interface. Okay, so I'm going to give those. Now I'm going to click Next. The next step is for each retention label, I can actually specify various descriptors. Think of these like metadata for your retention label. I can specify a reference ID, a business function or department, a category. There's actually a subcategory as well. I have an option to specify the authority type and the provision or citation. So if I fill these out, it looks a little bit like this. And again, these don't really have any impact on the functionality. They're simply to help you manage your retention labels when you do have a large retention schedule. Now, if I click Next, now I'm going to specify my label settings. I'm going to first click that little switch to turn on retention, and that gives me access to various settings. First of all, I'm going to choose the retention period. So first I'm going to say I'm going to retain this content. I could choose to actually delete this content as well and just use this like a deletion policy, a cleanup policy. But in this case, I'm going to use it as a retention policy. So I'm going to say I want to retain this content. I can choose for how long. So I can choose either the first drop down here lets me choose either forever or for a specific period of time. I would enter the amount of time, and then I would choose whether that is days, months, or years. I'm now going to choose what do I want to do after this time, so when the retention period expires. Your options are delete the content, trigger a disposition review, or nothing, just leave it where it is. Most organizations I work with almost always choose trigger a disposition review. Now when you choose that, you can actually choose who are the reviewers that get to approve the disposition. And here you can specify either usernames or a mail-enabled security group as well. What happens is when you specify people here or a group here, when the retention expires on a document, those individuals will receive an email telling them that a document has come up for potential disposition, and please go review this in the Disposition Review console. Now, sorry, just to back up here a second, I can then choose what do I want to retain or delete this content based on. This is really asking what is the trigger, and you have 4 options in here. I can choose when it was created, when it was last modified, when it was labeled, or an event. And then finally down here, I can choose use this label to classify the content as a record. Again, if I designate the document as a record, it can no longer be deleted or edited. And actually to remove that label, I can't remove the label from a document either once it's been declared as a record. I actually need to be a site collection administrator in SharePoint to go and remove the label on a document so that it can be relabeled. Now, if I click next, it shows me a summary of the settings I've chosen, and then I create the label. That label will now be added to my file plan here. Now, once I've created all the labels that I want to publish, or even when I create just a few, I can do this. I don't have to do this all at once. I can do this over time. So once I've created some labels that I want to publish, I'm now going to show you how to publish those labels through a retention label policy. So in the same console, in the same records management console, I'm now going to go to the Label Policies tab at the top there. And when I do that, I'm shown a list of my retention label policies. These are policies I've currently configured. Now I'm going to click on Publish Labels, and that's going to allow me to create a retention label policy. First of all, I'm going to choose the labels that I want to publish. So I'm going to click on that blue link, Choose Labels to Publish. When I do so, I'm going to click Add. That's going to show me all of the labels that I have currently. Here I can choose one or multiple labels to publish at one time. In this case, I'm going to choose 3, click Add, click Done Adding. This is just a summary of the labels that I chose. It shows me the time periods as well. Sometimes we choose a small time period just for testing purposes. And then we click Next. Now I'm going to choose the locations in which I want to publish it. So I can say publish it to all locations, or let me choose specific locations. And if I choose specific locations, I have 4 options available. I can choose either Exchange mailboxes, I can choose SharePoint sites, OneDrive for Business sites, or Office 365 groups, what has actually recently been renamed Microsoft 365 groups. I can choose all of these, so I can choose all Exchange mailboxes, or I can choose no Exchange mailboxes. I can choose very specific ones through choose recipients, or I can exclude certain recipients as well. And I can do that for each one of these options. Once I've chosen my location, I click Next. Now I name my policy and I give it a description, and I click Next. It shows me a summary, and finally I publish the labels. Now, for labels to actually show up on a site, remember the retention label policy, its purpose is to take a collection of labels and publish it to a site. Then it becomes available in a site for a user to choose. Usually it takes, I'll say, somewhere between 15 minutes and an hour in the testing that I've done in recent weeks. But I believe it can take up to 24 hours for labels to actually appear. I've seen it happen much, much quicker recently. Now let's take a look at the user experience. What is it like for a user to actually choose a retention label and apply to a document? So this is a typical SharePoint library. It's a modern SharePoint library. And to choose retention labels, you do need to be using modern SharePoint libraries. They're not available in classic SharePoint libraries. Now here, I'm going to click on a document. I'm just going to select a document, and I can select more than one if I wish. But in this example, I'm going to select just one. I'm now going to click on the document information panel. I'm going to click down a little further, and you'll notice there's an option for apply a retention label here, right? It looks like selecting a piece of metadata on a modern library. When I click on that dropdown, I'm presented with the list of retention labels that have been published to this site. Now, if I hover over any of these retention labels, it actually shows me that description for end users that I typed in earlier. You'll remember when I created the label, there was a description for administrators and there was a description for end users. So the description for end users is shown here. Once I choose that, we now see that the label shows up here in the document information panel, as well as a built-in metadata column that shows you what the retention label is. You can also see here there's a few other built-in metadata columns around when the retention label was applied and if it is a record as well, which I'm not showing here. That is the typical end user experience for applying a label manually. Now let's keep going, and we'll talk more about how we apply labels in an automated way in just a few minutes. Now let's get back to that retention policy that I talked about. Remember that third option for defining retention policies. We talked about retention labels, we talked about retention label policies, and we talked about a third option, retention policy. And I keep repeating this because the terminology, unfortunately, is a little confusing since all 3 options have very similar names. Now, when I want to create a retention label policy, we're going to come back here to the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. Okay, we're going to go back to the catalog. This time we're going to click on that information governance panel. Now, if I click on view there, it shows me a description of the information governance functionality. And then I'm going to click open solution. Now, this looks very similar to records management. You have labels, you have label policies, you have retention, you have a couple of other items like import and archive. Archive is typically for mailboxes, so we'll skip those other two right now. But the key point here is in the information governance solutions panel, this is showing you the records management capabilities that are available on at the E3 license level. Whereas for primarily E3, I shouldn't be too hard on that point. This is primarily used to make available the capabilities for E3 licensed users, whereas the records management solution panel is used to make available functionality for E5 or E5 compliant SKU license levels. So here, these retention policies are available to E3. The other two capabilities, retention labels and retention label policies I showed, and manually assigning those to documents, those are also available at E3. But in any case, to configure a retention policy, I go to information governance and I click on retention. Now here I can create a new retention policy. So I click on new retention policy. And this is going to guide me through a very similar wizard to creating a retention policy. So I give it a name and a description. Remember, this is like a blanket policy that I'm applying to a mailbox or a site or a OneDrive for Business site. I can't specify these kinds of policies granularly on individual documents. If I apply this to a site, it applies to all the documents in a site. Now, I can choose three options here. I can choose either to retain the content here for a particular period of time. Now, you'll notice here I only have two options on what is it based on. Retention policies are only based on when it was created or when it was last modified. They cannot be based on an event, and they cannot be based on when was the document labeled, because there is no label here. I can choose this next radio button here for, let me just use this to delete content. I can use this for a cleanup activity if I will. And then finally, there's some advanced retention options we'll see in just a moment. There's the delete option. And then the advanced options, I can choose to apply this label only to content that meets certain conditions. And there's two conditions available. It can either contain specific words or phrases, or it can contain sensitive info. Okay, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Let's follow the path of I want to retain this content for a period of time based on when it was created. So if I choose that, I then choose the locations that I can publish this retention policy. And remember, the retention policy had options for Exchange email, SharePoint sites, OneDrive for Business accounts, Microsoft 365 groups, Skype for Business chat, Exchange public folders, Team channel messages, or Teams chat. Now, if I choose these other four options down here, I cannot choose the options at the top. So what you end up doing is you have one policy for some of these or a few policies for some of these, and then different policies for Teams chat or Teams channel messages or these others. Typically, you end up with a set of policies that cover various conditions that are pertinent to your organization. So I choose my conditions here. I would get a next, I would get a screen that just shows me a summary of what I've chosen, and I would click Create Policy. And then that would be enforced immediately on the locations that I've chosen here. In this case, Exchange email, OneDrive for Business accounts, SharePoint sites, or Office 365 groups. Now, if I go back to that page that we saw a moment ago where I could choose to either retain the content for a period of time, delete the content, or base it on special conditions, advanced conditions. Remember, one of those conditions was specific words or phrases. Another was sensitive data types. They take you down a fairly familiar path if you've used these before. And I want to highlight a key difference here. You'll remember that when I created a retention policy to retain data, I had all of those various locations available, right? Here I had all these locations here available. Well, if I choose specific words or phrases, I only have these four options available. I cannot apply a retention policy with that kind of condition to Teams chat or Teams channel messages, for example, or Skype for Business or Exchange public folders. Only the four options here. Now, if I go back to here and I choose that sensitive data types option, again, I get a different set of locations that I'm allowed to apply this to. And this is even fewer. I can apply it to Exchange mailboxes, to SharePoint sites, or to OneDrive for Business accounts. So when you're defining your policies, whether you use retention labels or use retention policies, It's important to understand these differences because certain capabilities are available with only specific solutions. Okay, now let's talk about automatically applying retention labels, because it's great that an end user can go in and apply a retention label manually to individual documents, but typically we don't want our end users to have to understand our file plan, because typically they're made up of tens or hundreds and sometimes thousands of record types, and that becomes, very difficult for a user to remember, to understand, and typically it's not their job to manage records. So typically we'll want to automate this process. So there is a number of ways to automate applying retention labels. First of all, you can have a default retention label on a SharePoint library. So for every SharePoint library, I can go in and define, here's the default retention label to apply whenever a document is added to it. And I can actually have it retroactively go back and apply that label to all existing documents. Another option is I can assign a retention label to a folder. And I haven't mentioned it here, but the same thing applies for a document set. If I apply a retention label to a folder, it will automatically apply to the documents within the folder. And then finally, I can create policies that will automatically iterate through my content in an automated way and apply retention labels based on either sensitive information types or based on a search query. Again, those are keywords or phrases. Now, there's an important note at the bottom. In exchange, the auto application of retention policies for both of these bottom solutions here, they're only applied to emails that are newly sent. So as an email is going through in transit, there is no way to automatically apply retention labels or even manually apply retention labels to emails that are already sitting at rest in your mailbox. They are only applied as the document is in transit. And actually, I take that back. Let me clarify something. This here is specifically for sensitivity labels, not retention labels. I'll correct that in the slides before I publish them. Okay, so let's take a look at what it looks like to publish a retention label. Let's take a look at what it looks like to publish an auto apply retention label. So this is a policy, sometimes referred to as an auto apply policy, that will automatically iterate through your content and apply a retention label. So first of all, I would go back to that records management solution panel. I would go to label policies. I would click on auto apply a label. This will take me through a similar wizard to what you saw before. First of all, I would click on that blue link, choose a label to auto apply. I would choose one label here. I would click next, and I believe I can only choose one label in that case. Now, when I click next, remember here I'm applying it based on a sensitive information type. Now, sorry, I'm just getting to that example. So once I choose the label I want to auto apply, I have three options for how I want to auto apply it. It can be based on a sensitive information type. It can be based on specific words or phrases, so a search query, as I mentioned earlier, or a new third option called a trainable classifier. Now I'm going to choose sensitive information type. Now here, this is going to take me to a similar process to Office 365's DLP solution. If you've ever used the DLP solution, you have the system automatically look for sensitive data. Now, when we talk about sensitive data, we very specifically mean information that is based on a pattern or keywords. That pattern can be, for example, a credit card number, a social security number, a driver's license number. These types of identifiers are what we're talking about when we say sensitive information. Now, there's some groupings here of sensitive data types: financial, medical and health, or privacy. I can choose those here if I want to kind of simplify the selection process, or I can choose custom, and that lets me create a policy with whatever sensitive data types I want. So if I choose custom and I click next, I will then click add to add my sensitive data types. And now I can choose one or more sensitive data types to add to this policy. Now, Microsoft 365 has a little over 100 sensitive data types built into it. You can actually create your own custom sensitive data types as well. For example, if your company has an employee ID that follows a particular pattern and you want to look for that through HR documentation to identify personal information, you could create your own sensitive data type with your company's employee ID pattern. There is a separate window where you would go through and do that. Now here I'm selecting 6 sensitive data types, and they're all related to Canadian well-defined patterns for sensitive data. So passport numbers, health service numbers, driver's license numbers, social insurance numbers, and so on. But we have lots of others in here. As we said, there's a little over 100. There are US social security numbers, identifiers, national identifiers for many different nations around the world as well. Credit card numbers, as you can see here, the second last one is also a popular one. Now, once I add those to my query, I'm going to click Done. Now it's going to show me a summary of those sensitive data sets I chose. I'm going to click Next. I'm going to give my policy a name and a description. I'm going to choose the locations with which I want to apply. Remember earlier when we did a retention policy, we only had 3 options available for the locations: Exchange email, SharePoint sites, and OneDrive accounts. The same applies here. Those are the only 3 options I have for locations because I am creating an auto apply policy that's based on sensitive data types. I click Next, and then I click Auto Apply, and then the policy will be applied. Now, if we go back to this screen, and instead we choose Apply a label to content that contains specific words or phrases, right? This sometimes we refer to this as a search query. There's actually a language behind the scenes called the KQL, or the keyword query language, that actually allows you to define if you want simple or complex combinations of keywords and phrases. So when I click Next, here's where I specify my condition. In that keyword query editor, this is where you specify that pattern. Now, although I called it a language, it's actually not that complex. There's a little bit of a syntax that you need to learn. And there's a great reference online for that if you look up keyword query language. For example, if I want to apply this retention label to documents in SharePoint based on its content type, and let's say I've already configured a content type called contract document, the syntax for that would look something like this. I would have content type, no space, colon, and between a single quote, I would have the name of the content type. But I can then AND this with the author of a document. I can combine it with a number of other metadata fields if I wish. Now, once I've selected that query for it to go off and look for content, and again, this is going to iterate through content throughout my entire SharePoint environment. I give it a name, I choose the locations, and remember, based on what we saw earlier with retention policies, you now have 4 options of locations to choose here. The same applies here as we saw with retention policies. We're going to review our settings and we're going to auto apply. Now, once we create those auto apply policies, there are time periods that we have to wait. So once a label is auto applied, it's going to take a day for those labels to actually show up in the locations from which we can choose them. And then it actually takes up to 7 days, and I know this says 7 days, but really it's up to 7 days before the label actually gets applied to content. There are timer jobs running behind the scenes, and the timer jobs that auto apply these policies actually run once every 7 days. So depending where you are in the week, you're going to wait up to 7 days for those labels to be applied to your content. Now, there's some other rules to be aware of as well. Because we have both users that apply policies explicitly to content, so if I go to a document and apply a retention label, or I have automated policies that can apply these, and then I can have other retention labels that are automatically applied based on the library I put a document into, there are rules of precedence to be aware of. So a retention label will always win out over deletion. The longest retention period, so if you have a situation where 2 retention periods are applied to a document, the longest retention period will always win. Explicit inclusion wins out over implicit inclusion. So if I explicitly apply a label to a document, that will take precedence over a rule that is automatically applying a label to a document. So a user can actually go apply a label to a document to change an automatically applied label, as long as that document was not declared a record as part of that label. And then finally, if you have deletion policies that are being applied, the shortest deletion policy will win. Continuing on, we're being cognizant of time, still have quite a bit of content to go through, so I'll try to go through some of this. I talked about that third option that you can choose when you're automatically applying retention labels, trainable classifiers. This is a fairly new feature. It's still in preview. With this feature, Microsoft has introduced machine learning models that you can actually use to automatically have the system learn the different types of content that you have, and from those models, automatically apply retention periods to your document. Now, Today, those models, there's actually 6 models built into the system. There's one for offensive language, there's one looking for resumes, another for source code, another for harassment, one for profanity, and one for threat. You can actually go create your own machine learning models for trainable classifiers. So you can actually have the system learn from the content you have. What does a contract look like? What does an invoice look like? And based on these models, automatically assign retention periods to those documents. The offensive language one is being deprecated on Force due to a large number of false positives. So it is important to be aware that as you use machine learning models to automatically apply labels, the larger sample size that you can give it, the better that model will learn what does a particular type of document look like. But you still may get false positives. So it's important to understand that that is the nature of automatically applying labels in this way. Now, we talked about the file plan a little bit. The file plan is the collection of record categories for your organization or record types. In this case, it's the collection of record labels it's the collection of retention labels for your organization. And you can actually use import and export capabilities to bring in an Excel spreadsheet of your labels into Microsoft 365 as part of the file plan. You can also export your labels to an Excel spreadsheet if you need to. And that's particularly useful if you have a really large retention schedule. There is a disposition review process, so there is a disposition review console that when documents expire, the people who are allowed to approve the disposition of the documents can actually go to that console, and they have 3 options. They can choose 1 or more documents, they can filter this list that are available for disposition, and they can choose to either dispose of the document, extend the retention, or relabel the document. And when you dispose of the document, the record of that disposition is actually stored and maintained in the audit log within Office 365. That audit log entry for a disposition serves as your certificate of destruction. The time period with which that certificate of destruction or that audit log entry is retained does depend on your license. Now, event-based retention, as we talked about, types of events that we typically think of are an employee leaving an organization, a contract expiring, a product reaching end of life. Microsoft does have a very robust system built into Microsoft 365 for event-based retention. Other examples we think of are fiscal year end or calendar year end. And the frequency with which events might occur often demands some form of automation. So often we will build some automation around event-based retention to make it really simple for an HR person to specify this employee with this employee ID left the organization and have that automatically trigger the event which causes the retention period to start. I'm going to skip over this retention. Well, specifying retention labels. There's a process that you go through. First, you create the label, you designate it as an event-based label, you create the event type, and you choose that event as part of it. You then need to publish the label, and you need to add an event ID. For example, when an employee leaves an organization, you don't want to remove, you don't want to trigger the disposition on all employee records, just that employee's records. So there's some ID that needs to identify that this particular set of documents is related to that employee, and therefore the event is triggered only on those sets of documents. And then when the person leaves the organization, you do need to trigger the event to occur, and that's typically where the automation I mentioned comes in. There is a record versioning feature that was recently introduced as well, late last year, that allows you to edit specific versions of records or to designate specific versions of a document as a record. There's a lock process that you need to unlock a document, make edits to it, relock it to have it declared as a record. And that's where you can have different versions of documents within the version history actually have a retention period associated with them. Now, all the versions for a particular document that are declared as records will all have the same retention period. We talked a little bit about in the information governance panel, giving you access to the E3 capabilities for records management, whereas the records management solution panel gives you access to the more robust E5 capabilities. Typically, we think of the automated ways of applying retention, as well as event-based retention, disposition review, and file plan management, all of those being the collection of E5 capabilities or E5 compliant SKU capabilities, if you wish. So there's those two solution panels that's important to recognize, either information governance or records management. Now I'm going to talk briefly about Microsoft Information Protection. This is Microsoft's solution for applying sensitivity to documents. By sensitivity, we mean classification levels like public, internal only, confidential, restricted, these types of things. Now, the way this solution looks, the experience for the end user is actually a sensitivity button that you can see up here, which brings down a menu, or a toolbar that's added to applications like Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Microsoft Outlook. And the actual sensitivity labels that are defined and managed centrally are actually displayed for the user within those applications for them to choose. You can apply them to Office documents, to PDF documents, as well as other types of documents and files. And as a result of applying these, there's a number of automated protections that can happen. You can automatically assign headers, footers, and watermarks to documents. In the example here, you can see confidential is added as a header, footer, watermark. And you can automatically apply encryption and rights management to documents. Those rights management are things like do not print, do not forward in an email. And these protections actually travel with the document. So if someone exfiltrates or inappropriately shares a document outside the organization and it's not encrypted for the audience it was inadvertently shared with, they will not be able to open it because it's been encrypted for others who are permitted to access the document. So it's a great solution for identifying documents as sensitive, helping people in the organization understand what content is sensitive, and then protecting that content and having that protection actually travel with the document. Okay, and just another example of seeing that within email. You see the exact same ribbon in Microsoft Outlook for an email when you're composing an email. And that'll add a header and footer to your email, as well as encrypt an email and apply certain rights to it that are managed when people receive the email. Okay, you can see the headers, footers there. I can also apply to any document by right-clicking on a document on my desktop, selecting Classify and Protect, and then a dialog will appear, allowing me to choose from the same sensitivity labels. Again, those sensitivity labels are managed centrally within the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. Okay. And a few last-minute thoughts. I know I'm a couple minutes over time. Hopefully I can still keep you for a couple minutes. Some great new enhancements that were introduced to Microsoft Information Protection. The first being that e-discovery and collaboration solutions like SharePoint and OneDrive can now view and scan or index MIP protected documents. So previously they couldn't. If you had an MIP protected document that was encrypted, you uploaded it to a SharePoint library, no longer could you search on it. No longer could e-discovery or Office 365 DLP actually act on that document. We would say SharePoint couldn't reason over the document anymore because it was encrypted. Well, now it is possible to have those documents be reasoned over, and for e-discovery and search and DLP work with those documents. And you do need to turn that on. So within information protection, you need to actually click turn on. There's a few other great capabilities here that were added. Two final ones were sensitivity labels now can be applied in an automated way to documents in SharePoint and Teams and SharePoint and OneDrive. So there's actually service-based sensitivity labels that can be applied to documents. As well, sensitivity labels are coming to SharePoint sites and Teams and Microsoft 365 groups, so that when you create a site or you create a team or you create a group, you actually choose what the sensitivity is based on the sensitivity labels. And just some final words on next steps. Please do research these capabilities further, try them out, understand what Microsoft's capabilities for modern records management are, the fact that their records management occurs in place, that it's available across all workloads throughout Microsoft 365. Make sure that you include information protection in your data governance strategy for managing records, and then transform and modernize how records are managed in your organization. And go manage your records. And I'll just say thanks everyone for your time. Please do let me know if there's any questions. I will be posting my slides and posting to Twitter a link to the slides so that when they're available.